Welcome to Politically Basic. I'm your host, Kyle Campbell. We're breaking down the basics of all political issues and current political events so that you get to decide. And oh, we have got a good one today. We're talking all about the Electoral College. It's a presidential election year, a crazy one, and our elections processes matter more than ever. I've got on the show with me today one of my favorite political insiders, Electoral College expert Trent England. He is the founder and executive director of Save Our States. He also serves as co-chairman of the Stop Ranked Choice Voting Coalition and is the David and Ann Brown Distinguished Fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. He produced an outstanding feature-length documentary film that is a must-watch. It's called Safeguard, an Electoral College Story. He also wrote Why We Must Defend the Electoral College, and he's co-author of The Case Against Ranked Choice Voting, The Heritage Guide to the Constitution and One Nation Under Arrest. Okay, team, hold on to something because by the time we are done, you're going to know so much about the Electoral College. Trent, thank you so much for being with me on the show today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Kyle. Thank you.
Well, I want to start way back. Let's start at the beginning with the very basics of our political system here in the United States. Can you walk us through the differences between what is often heard as the descriptor of our political system? We talk about and hear about democracy versus a democratic republic versus what is a constitutional republic.
Yeah, and it's important to kind of understand what these terms I'll say can mean, right? Because people use them in different ways. So, you don't always know what someone means when they're saying our democracy or talking about a republic. But the founders saw these words having particular kinds of meanings. And, democracy can just mean a government that has elections, right? Any kind of elections. But of course, Russia has elections, Iran has elections, right? What elections really mean and how they really work, the devil is in the details there, right? A republic is a kind of a government where we have representation, where we're using elections, we're using democratic processes to create representation because we recognize that democracy, right, the will of the people isn't all that matters. There's something else out there that we might call justice, we might call our individual rights or human rights. And even if you have a majority that wants to do something that's unjust or trample on your individual human rights, we want to constrain that majority. We don't just want democracy in the sense that the majority gets to do whatever they want. And when the founders talked about democracy, oftentimes that's what they were thinking of, right? A democracy was a government where the power is fully in the people. And so if the people want to do something that's unjust, that's downright evil, well, the people can do that, right? And then you have, a democratic republic can be a government where you have representation, but you don't really have the restraints of a constitution. A constitutional republic, right? This is where we come to the kind of political system that we were given, is a government that really recognizes, right? We want to enshrine these rights and these processes that protect justice in a constitution, right? And then we have democratic processes to create representation, to create that republic, but it's all in the context of a constitution. And so, these can be sort of complicated terms, but they do matter because if we sort of lapse into just talking about our democracy, it's easy to forget that there can be a real difference between, what Benjamin Franklin supposedly said, right? A democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner, right? And a constitutional republic where, even if you have two wolves and a sheep, that sheep is going to have its individual rights protected in the Constitution, and those two wolves can't just vote to eat it. So, these are concepts that actually can really matter to what we think of our country and where we want to go as a country.
I appreciate you breaking that down. So here in the United States, we are a constitutional republic, and personal rights, personal freedoms matter here and are protected. And that's what makes America so unique in so many ways. Now, we started off, of course, as 13 colonies in this country, but one nation, and those turned into states. So we are one nation full of states. And to understand how this all works together and our processes of elections and electing a president, which we're having a lot of discussions about recently, it's really important to understand the concept of federalism. Can you explain that for our listeners? What is federalism and what does that mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to remind people, it's we are both united and we're states, right? And these things are important together. Our system of federalism is a system that recognizes that the basic units of government are the states. That's the constitutional design. And Kyle, as you said, the Declaration of Independence, if people go and read the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it really sort of explains or at least alludes to that fact, right? We're these individual colonies, but we're sort of one people at the same time, and we're separating the individual political bonds between each colony and the British Crown, but at the same time we're speaking and acting as one, as what would become one nation. Federalism says the states are sort of at the center. And most people think of this in terms of the states versus the federal government, but it's also true when it comes to local government. Every county, every city, every school district, those are created by the state government. The state government is creating local governments and sharing some of that state power down into the local governments, right? And in the same way, the state governments created the Constitution, right? Those 13 original colonies, original states, they created the Constitution to begin with. And the political power is supposed to be we the people within each of our individual states. That's the structure of the Constitution that we often call federalism.
Right. So when this nation was founded, we had settlers coming from England and a monarchy and a king, and one king really ruled and made all the decisions. And so that's what I think is so great about federalism, is that it respects your smaller communities. It respects the states, instead of us just having one ruler out there in Washington, D.C., making all the rules and forcing everybody to comply. So our system of government is unique in that I think more than almost any other in the world, it really respects that personal, individual liberty and those rights. And so it is really so worth understanding and really preserving. So thank you for breaking that down for us. You produced this fantastic documentary. It's called Safeguard: An Electoral College Story, and it really it brings together so many experts on this issue, and it goes through the history of how this all came about and why, what the Electoral College is about, how it works, which is a little complicated, and we're going to unpack here today. But it's just I call it a must watch. It is so good. It's not terribly long. I'm going to offer that I had to pause and rewatch a couple parts a couple of times. I just want to make sure I'm understanding all of this, because it is a very complex system that works really beautifully together, but it's not as straightforward as just maybe having a popular vote would be, right? So let's talk about what the Electoral College is. It's not a college in the sense of what we think, or how we use that terminology here on a daily basis. But Trent, give it to us. What is it and how does it work?
Yeah, I think it can be helpful to go back to the Constitutional Convention and just remember that the rough draft of the Constitution, what they started out with, which was called the Virginia Plan, had a parliamentary system, and some people will be familiar with that kind of a system. Most of the major Western countries around the world have that kind of a government, right? Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, Japan, Israel. They have parliaments where the people go and they vote for their members of parliament, right? Which is like their Congress. And then those members of parliament turn around and vote for the prime minister. So to choose the prime minister is a two-step democratic process because you have people voting for their members of parliament, and then the members of parliament voting on who will become the prime minister. And that's what the Constitution, that's what the rough draft of the Constitution originally said. We would elect members of Congress. Members of Congress would elect the president of the United States. The founders didn't want that because those kind of systems don't have good separation of powers. There's not a separation between the parliament and the prime minister, the legislative branch and the executive branch. And the founders honestly kind of scratched their head. There was no other obvious model for how to elect a national leader, right? The national executive. Nobody was just voting directly, and there's real shortcomings to that, which maybe we'll talk about later. But there's real reasons not to just have one big nationwide election. And again, most of these countries around the world don't do that. Almost none of the big countries do that. So one of the delegates from Pennsylvania says, well, what if we had a system, kind of like the parliamentary system, but where states are choosing separate delegates, right? Not members of Congress, but somebody else. And then those people choose the president of the United States. And this idea percolates through the whole Constitutional Convention. They keep coming up and having this debate, and then sort of shelving it and dealing with other issues and then coming back to it. Finally, at the very end, they create the Electoral College, which is like a parliamentary system or like, the system of Congress electing the president in a couple of ways. One is every state has exactly the number of electors, presidential electors, that it has in Congress, in the U.S. House plus the U.S. Senate. Every state has 2 U.S. senators, and every state has at least one member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and more for bigger states. California is the biggest state. They have 52 members of the U.S. House, so they have 54 electoral votes. Again, exactly the same number that they have members of Congress combined between both houses, right? So in a way, this is just modeled off of Congress, but these are different people. They're not members of Congress. So you have that separation of powers. Congress doesn't control who is the president, which would give them a lot of power over the president and the whole executive branch. And then you have the question, though, well, how do you choose these delegates, these presidential electors? And in the spirit of federalism, like we were just talking about, the Constitutional Convention said, well, we will leave that up to state legislatures. So the legislature in each state gets to decide how they want to choose presidential electors. So the California legislature, the Oklahoma legislature, where I am, they pass a law and say, this is how we're going to choose our presidential electors. And today, every state has an election, right? So all the people of California vote. They choose who those 54 electors from California are going to be. Same thing here in Oklahoma. 2 states do it just a little bit differently, but it shows that the power that these state legislatures have. In Maine and Nebraska, they elect one presidential elector from within each congressional district. And then they have 2 more, right, for their U.S. senators, essentially. So they elect those statewide. But every state is holding an election to choose the state's presidential electors. And some of these people say, well, wait, hold on. So who are these electors, though? Where are they coming from? How are they getting elected? And they're elected officials kind of just like any other elected officials chosen statewide. In the state of California, for governor, attorney general, secretary of state, the Republican Party nominates a person for each one of those offices. The Democratic Party nominates a person for each one of those offices. And in California or every other state, the Republican Party nominates 54 people to be the presidential electors if the Republicans were so fortunate as to win California, which they used to do. And the Democrats nominate 54 people to be California's presidential electors. They're most likely to be the ones who get elected this November, right? But they're literally elected as state officials, as the presidential electors for the state of California. And then they go on to cast the electoral votes on behalf of the state. Uh, they'll cast one vote for president, one vote for vice president. That people can find that process in the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. That was one little modification that was made very early on to our electoral college system. And that's how the presidential election process works. It's a two-step democratic election, and I think it's important to recognize that, right? It is a democratic process. It's fully democratic, right? We vote in our states. We choose our state's presidential electors. Our presidential electors vote for president and vice president. So it's a two-step election. It is similar to, but obviously also different from these parliamentary systems that we see in, other countries all around the world.
Okay, I want to help our audience make this connection because this is where I think that we get lost. So, taking California as an example, and I think it's a very good example, it has the most electoral votes up for grabs. It has 55. So, in a presidential election, so come November 5th, which we are just about at here, everybody who can vote, rolling with that assumption that everyone who is eligible to vote in the state of California and who does vote is going to fill in a bubble for someone for the office of president. Now, there are 54 Republican electors, you said, and 54 Democrat electors. What is the process between the people, the voters in the state of California, and what those electors do?
Yeah.
That's the disconnect there, I think, for a lot of people is if the electors are voting based on how the people are voting, why don't we just have the people vote and then just see how that plays out?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question because the Electoral College in this way doesn't work the way some of the American founders thought it would work. Some of the American founders thought, and this sort of makes sense when you remember that they all knew George Washington would be elected president in the first election, and many of them hoped that George Washington would be elected over and over and over again. I mean, we didn't have term limits for president until the 20th century, and so they thought, well, somehow states will choose presidential electors. Some states had elections pretty much right from the beginning. Other states, the state legislatures just chose their presidential electors. But either way, they were elected officials in their states, and they thought, well, these people will deliberate. They'll debate who to cast the state's electoral votes for, and and again, when everybody knew that they were going to cast their votes for George Washington, that was sort of an easy way to think about it. But very quickly, right, it became a partisan process, right? You had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonians back then, right? And so states were choosing presidential electors in order to vote for either John Adams or Thomas Jefferson, right? And they had very strong feelings about how, these presidential electors ought to vote. And that's how we look at it today, right? If California chooses the Democratic presidential electors, the people nominated by the Democratic Party, they're expected to vote for the Democratic nominees for president and vice president. And California actually has a law that says they have to do that. They have to vote for the Democratic nominee for president and vice president. Now, again, these are people nominated by the Democratic Party, so they're very, very likely to do that. And even back when no state had a law that required presidential electors to vote the way that the people of the state sort of wanted them to vote, the way the people of the state had voted, this whole question of presidential electors, sometimes they're called faithless electors, voting in a different way never mattered in any election. There was never an election where it was, even close to changing the outcome. It was always about people sort of making a statement, I'm going to vote for somebody else because, I'm frustrated with something or something like that, but never to try to change the outcome. So that I think that's a part of the answer to that question, right? These presidential electors in many states are literally bound, but in every state they're overwhelmingly likely to vote the way the state votes. So why don't we just have a direct election? Well, the problem with that is that there's no checks and balances in a system like that. And this is, again, this is why other countries have parliamentary systems as well, right? Britain doesn't have a direct nationwide popular vote for prime minister. Canada doesn't do that, right? Japan, Israel, none of these places do that, because if you use a two-step process, you prevent regional politics. You prevent a political system where one party can say, well, we're really strong in this part of the country, and so we're just going to focus on, driving turnout and intensity. And in the worst cases, as I think used to be very common in 19th century American politics, we're going to use our political power that's so dominant in a particular state to make it hard for the other side to vote, right? The whole question of voter suppression. The Electoral College makes it very hard, virtually impossible, for a political party to win the presidency that way, because you have to win a whole bunch of states, which means that, sometimes people say, oh, well, only the swing states matter. It's not true at all. A political party, just to be legitimate, just to have a chance of winning, has got to be really popular in a lot of places around the country, right? I mean, if the Democrats didn't have California, if the Republicans didn't have Texas, and Florida, they wouldn't be credible political parties, right? They would have to either find a way to, reach out and appeal to some of these states, or some other political party would come along, as the Republicans did in the 19th century, to sort of take over from the Whigs and some other smaller parties, right? You have to have a big nationwide coalition with the Electoral College. And if everybody just voted directly for president, you wouldn't need that. And you easily could see politics devolve into a very regional battle. And you might see a lot of other parties pop up, which means that you might not have people coalescing around someone where, every president in American history, since we've had states voting, has had support from more than 40% of the electorate, other than Abraham Lincoln. And that was a very unusual election. People can go look that up. He was just under 40%. But that's because the Electoral College forces us to have these giant coalitions, these giant nationwide coalitions, rather than a bunch of regional splinter parties all around the country. Those are some of the reasons why we have an Electoral College. We have this two-step election process, rather than just having a big direct nationwide vote. There's no big, quote unquote democracy that actually does that. France is the closest, but France has a two-step election in time. They have two rounds of that election. And even there, they have a lot of problems with people feeling like it's actually not very democratic.
Right. So the Electoral College really exists to ensure that things are fair. But it's so interesting that there is a coalition in this country. There is a significant percentage of people who think that it is unfair because this conversation comes up a lot when you have an election like we saw in 2016, right? Donald Trump wins more than 270 electoral votes. That's the threshold you need to win, right? Out of, 538? You need at least 270. So he wins the electoral votes, but Hillary Clinton wins the popular vote. And it really, of course, surprised people, and it upset people. Always, when someone's on the losing side, they're going to be upset and kind of try to maybe place blame on the system or places where they can do that. But why, in your estimation, are we looking at that factor also? If it is just going to maybe sometimes cause division, that's not how we make a determination. Yet in our elections, especially in our presidential election, we're looking at the percentage, we're looking at the popular vote. And then naturally we have a lot of people say, hey, that doesn't look right to me. You have one candidate with a significant majority of the popular vote, yet losing an election. Do you think that is still a good way of proceeding through this presidential election process, and why would that be helpful to also have that element in there?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different facts that people should remember when this comes up that help us understand why the Electoral College really is fair. One is that all these presidential elections are being run under a set of rules, and that set of rules is essentially the Electoral College. And so the candidates, the campaigns, everything is designed to win under that set of rules. Nobody is trying to win the quote unquote popular vote. If they were trying to win the popular vote, right, if the rules were different, then the campaigns would be run differently and the outcome would be different, right? The support in different states would be different. The popular vote result would be different, right? It might ultimately be the same. It might ultimately be flip-flop the other way. Every high-level political consultant that you talk to about this will agree with this, right? If the campaigns were run to win the most popular votes, they would be run very, very differently. And that, suggests, right, if campaigns matter at all those billions of dollars that get spent, then the results would be different, right? So that's one thing to remember about this claim, right? The popular vote number with the Electoral College just doesn't really matter. And the other thing is, in an election like 2016, the Electoral College worked exactly as it was designed to work, right? It created an incentive for both parties that, both parties have strong bases in different parts of the country, right? They have a lot of places where they are already really popular, right? So the Electoral College says, okay, you're already popular in those places. Now you got to go and you got to build a bigger coalition. You got to win over people in some states where you're a little bit behind, right? And Donald Trump did that. Whether people like him or don't like him, he went and appealed to voters in what we call the Rust Belt, right? In states that Republicans hadn't won for a long time. He won a lot of voters over who had voted for Barack Obama, right? They've been voting for Democrats and they switched over and voted for Donald Trump, right? He persuaded people. He broadened the Republican coalition in that way. And if you look at some of the analysis on the Democratic side, they were very frustrated with Hillary Clinton's campaign because she seemed a lot less interested in doing that. She actually didn't campaign as much toward the end in some of those states. She was out in California where, the Democrats are very popular right now for a part of the time leading up to the to Election Day, right? And people rightly criticized her for that, right? I think the media had convinced her that she was going to win no matter what. And the Electoral College rewards campaigns that reach out and build broader coalitions. And the flip side is it punishes campaigns, political parties that don't want to talk to as diverse a group of Americans. So, I think that's a powerful force for good, right? To have a set of political rules that reward political parties and presidential campaigns for reaching out, for having a more diverse coalition. And I think that's a very good thing that that shows why this idea that, well, we should just look at the raw popular vote number and go with that, it has some real drawbacks.
It's a very good thing. One element of your documentary that really explained this the best that I have had it explained, and thank God for baseball analogies. Everybody can track with this, but you made a World Series analogy of how electors work, and it makes perfect sense when you explain it this way. Can you explain it for us today?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The World Series is a series of baseball games, right? And it's not decided by which team over the course of all of those games scores the most total runs. The World Series is all about winning games. And we've seen World Series before where one team wins more games, even though the other team, during the course of those games, actually scored more total runs. And that's because you might have a game where you win by a big margin, right? And then you might have several other games where you lose by a small margin. And when you add up all the runs, your team might have won more runs across all of the games, but still lost more games. And everybody knows that that team is the losing team because everybody knows the rules. The rules are that the winner of the World Series is the team that won the most games, not the team that scored the most runs. That's how it works under the Electoral College as well. And if right, it's not the total number of popular votes, it's the number of electoral votes won out of the state by state campaign. And if the World Series was conducted in a different way, if the World Series was about scoring the most runs and not winning the most games, then teams would play differently. And I don't know a lot about baseball, so I'm not quite sure how differently the teams would play and what that would look like. But it would look like a different process, a different strategy. And if presidential campaigns were just trying to win the most raw popular votes nationwide, then those campaigns would operate differently as well.
Right. So the Electoral College rules ask candidates to play and win in as many states as they can. And another thing that you have shared and that shared in this documentary that really, I think, helps kind of paint this picture of why the Electoral College ensures fairness in our election systems is you look at the cities that a candidate under a national popular vote would only need to focus on. It's a handful. It's, what did you say, New York, Boston, Chicago, LA, San Francisco. So a candidate could just merely focus on 5 or 6 major, highly populated cities, promise them things, campaign there, be sort of committed to those populous areas and ignore the rest of the nation and campaign that way and potentially run an entire country that way, more focused on those few cities. Am I understanding that right? If we didn't have the Electoral College.
No, that's right. When the founders designed the Electoral College, they were worried about big states because there were only 13 states, but a couple of those states, Virginia and New York, were much bigger than most of the rest, and some of the states were really, really small. And of course, we still have that dynamic today. I mean, California is very large with Florida, Texas, and trying to catch up. I was going to say New York, but New York seems to be losing population lately. So we have some very big states. We have some very small states. North Dakota, Wyoming, and the Electoral College creates a balance there. But today, right, it really is more about media markets. If we didn't have the Electoral College, these big metropolitan areas, these big media markets like Los Angeles, New York. I mean, Los Angeles is a good example. I used to live for a few years in LA County. LA County has about 10 million people in it. There are many states that have most states have a smaller population than that, right? Just LA County has the potential. It would have massive political power without the Electoral College. And of course, it's not that California doesn't have a lot of power. It has the most electoral votes. It also has the most members of the U.S. House of Representatives, right? So California has a lot of political power based on the fact that it has a lot of population. But if we believe in checks and balances, right, we want some upper limit on how much power any one state or any one city or any one media market can have. And yeah, that's what the Electoral College does, right? It provides some basic fairness in our election process by making sure that we have some checks and balances in presidential elections.
I want to ask you about this terminology of calling America an experiment. We hear that all the time, the American experiment. And we know that the framers of our Constitution and the men who created this constitutional republic deliberated for so long. They went back and forth. They prayed over it. They thought about it. And I think it was Benjamin Franklin who, when asked, said, you have a republic if you can keep it. This has been an experiment for almost 250 years. What does that mean, that we are living in a governmental experiment here?
Yeah, the American founders to me are impressive in several different ways. But one of the ways that one of the aspects of the founders that really impresses me when I study them is that they were humble. And to call something, think of something as an experiment shows a kind of humility. And I actually love this about the Electoral College because, as I mentioned before, it doesn't work exactly the way that some of the founders thought it would work. It turns out it actually works better than many of them thought it would work, which I love that fact, right? They created something, in this case, brand new, and it worked so well that actually India and Germany copied it when they wrote their constitutions around 1950. They actually put versions of an electoral college in their constitutions that they still use today. So we are living in this experiment that has worked exceedingly well so far, and the founders recognize that. There's one comment, I forget who made it, but one of the founders, they were having a discussion. I believe it was at the convention, and someone is talking about, what conditions will be like, I think in 50 years or a century, something like that. And someone else says, it's pretty arrogant of us to think that all this will still be around in the same form, a generation or two from now. And lo and behold, it survived a whole lot longer than that. But I think it's important when we recognize that we're living in this experiment that has been so successful, that a part of it is the Constitution itself, right? And a part of it is the ideas in the Declaration of Independence that are expressed, that sort of undergird, tell us why we have the Constitution. But ultimately, the system has been successful because the American people, over much of that time, have taken the time and invested the effort to understand the Constitution, and have really believed in those principles of the Declaration of Independence. Now, not perfectly, obviously. No human being is perfect, and there are lots of failures in American history, lots of times when we've had to rise to the occasion and do better. But still, we've been a nation dedicated to these ideas, and these principles, and then this Constitution that takes those ideas and creates a structure that allows them to be justified and improved upon as we go. And it's a good reminder, this experiment can fail if the American people don't continue to sort of refresh our dedication to those principles and our understanding and our adherence to that Constitution.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best ways that we do preserve that and fulfill our duty to protect it is to understand about it. So I'm so glad that you're breaking this down for us today, Trent. There was another element of this that I found so fascinating. So the Electoral College protects the process of elections geographically and how candidates campaign, but it also kind of protects the process financially. So you give a great example of Michael Bloomberg and his campaign. When was that? When did he run? 2000?
2016.
2016, right. And he just dumped an insane amount of money into this campaign. You guys broke it down, and it was something like $7 million a day he was spending to run for president. Because at that time, too, if you look at the media landscape and the number of major media markets at that time compared to today, even, 8 short years later and only 2 presidential election cycles later, the media is very different. So he was flooding the major media markets with $7 million a day. And we know that that didn't go so well for him. Was that the Electoral College putting those guardrails in place? And then I also want to know your thoughts on, can that still be accomplished today with so much social media and alternative media options?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting sort of twist to the effects of the Electoral College, because it's not a direct effect, but it is an effect of the political system that has grown up around the Electoral College, I think. Uh, I mentioned that political parties need to start off the process of running a candidate for president by already being popular in a lot of states. That is one of the political realities created by the Electoral College that I think is a good thing, right? It forces the political parties to be national and be these big coalitions. So the trouble for a billionaire like Michael Bloomberg, or if Oprah decided to run for president, or anyone like that who has a fantastic fortune and a big name, these are the kind of people that the founders were, I think, a little bit concerned about, right? Someone who might be considered a demagogue, or who has, for whatever reason, the ability to manipulate public opinion. The founders recognized it's hard to do that state by state. You might be able to do that in a couple of states, in one region, in some big cities, some big states, but doing that nationwide, or even across, half the states, that's going to be much more difficult. And it turns out that's absolutely true, and especially true now that we have not 13, but 50 states. Michael Bloomberg could be very popular in New York. Obviously, he had been the mayor of New York City, so he had won a couple of elections in the New York in New York City. Uh, but taking that popularity, even with billions of dollars beyond that region, and trying to build a nationwide following, would be very difficult. So he had to go and try to win the Democratic Party's nomination, right? That was what Michael Bloomberg tried to do, despite the fact that he used to be a Republican in New York, albeit a very, moderate or sort of left-leaning Republican. But he had to pick one of the political parties. He couldn't just use his billions of dollars to run a presidential election, because he recognized that with the Electoral College doesn't really work. Ross Perot discovered the same thing in 1992. He was quite popular. Actually, he came in second place in 2 different states. But Ross Perot, despite winning 19% of the popular votes, didn't win any electoral votes because he just didn't have nationwide popularity. He didn't have a base of popularity to start from. And I think people can see that as can see a downside there. People might say, well, we'd like to have some new different voices in politics, but the reality is uh, the political parties are changing all the time. Michael Bloomberg made his attempt to become the nominee of the Democratic Party, and it just didn't work. Donald Trump made his attempt to be the nominee of the Republican Party, and it did, right? So we do see a lot of churn and a lot of ideological diversity in our political parties. But the Electoral College also means that we have some stability, and that demagogues, billionaires, have a little bit of a harder time trying to mount a presidential campaign.
Let's go to the other side of this issue. Now, we know that the Electoral College protects against somebody throwing a whole lot of money at potential voters. We know it protects against a candidate focusing on large population centers. Let's talk about minorities. There is an opinion out there that the Electoral College is prejudiced against minorities and harmful to minorities. What do you say about that?
So that's a really modern position, in 21st century, like modern. In the 20th century, the Electoral College was understood to protect the interests of minority Americans. And I think that's still true today, even though people seem to have forgotten that. Back in the 1960s, there was an effort to get rid of the Electoral College that was driven by people who did not want, particularly Black Americans, to be playing a role in American politics and presidential politics. They were very honest about that, right? They wanted to get rid of the Electoral College in order to get rid of Black voices in American politics. Now, how does that work? Why did they think that those two things were connected? Well, we've talked about how the Electoral College forces the political parties to have these big nationwide diverse coalitions, and that's true in all kinds of ways. One of the ways is, and you could see this back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the Democratic Party was always desperate to win votes, to win states outside of the Deep South. The Democratic Party was very strong in the Deep South, but to win presidential elections, that wasn't enough. And so this is where you get the Democratic Party, despite having a lot of diehard racists in the Deep South, in the Democratic Party, they were also reaching out to Black voters in northern cities, trying to win some northern states. And that was the Electoral College at work, right? That was this system that the American founders created that pushes the political parties to reach out to more diverse communities. And that can mean more racially diverse communities. It can also mean that today you see, Republicans desperate to broaden their appeal to Hispanics to win in states like Texas and Arizona and Nevada, while the Democrats have to moderate on positions like gun control because it hurts them too much in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So you see both parties, even today, struggling to have these diverse coalitions. And the argument that the Electoral College hurts minorities is just a very simple, there are a lot of minorities who live in safe states. And if you live in a safe state and you don't really understand how the Electoral College works to shape American politics, you might feel like you're not being represented. And so people say, well, there's a lot of minorities in those states. They're not being represented because their votes, quote unquote, don't matter. It's just a misunderstanding of how the Electoral College works over time, right? People take a snapshot of one election or one moment in an election and they say, well, I feel like my voice isn't being heard. And they forget that California is in some ways the foundation of the Democratic Party. It's essential to Democratic victories in presidential elections. Not to mention, in any time the Democrats have controlled the House of Representatives in recent memory, you could say it's all because of the number of seats in the House that they're able to win from California, right? So people shouldn't feel like they're disenfranchised or their voices aren't heard just because they live in a state that a political party tends to dominate. In a way, they're really the beginning of that political party's power.
I've referenced your documentary a couple times, but I would again here just kind of pause and really encourage people to watch Safeguard because it talks about the history of slavery in this nation and really makes the case that the reason Abraham Lincoln was president during that time and the reason that our nation was able to get through slavery and come out where we did was really largely due to having the system of the Electoral College. And it's just remarkable to go and see that history laid out and that reasoning laid out. So I really encourage people to watch that. So we know that the EC cannot be manipulated financially, cannot be manipulated geographically. It protects everybody regardless of your race or your position or where you live in the country, what you do. How can the Electoral College be gamed? How could somebody come at it and work that system? And is that possible even?
Yeah, we have seen talk in the 20th century, certainly from independent third party candidates about trying to win some electoral votes so that they could deprive the major party candidates of a majority and then throw the election into the House of Representatives, because the Electoral College requires that you have a majority of electoral votes to become president and vice president. If you don't, then the president is elected by the House of Representatives. The vice president is elected by the Senate. Again, people can find the details of all this in the Constitution if you're interested. But we we've had talk about that, and some people say, oh, that could happen, and that's a concern. I don't think it's a major concern. Again, Michael Bloomberg couldn't even get across the initial threshold to be nominated by a party, despite his just unimaginably vast fortune that he spent on his presidential campaign. He got nowhere. And Ross Perot, who also very wealthy and much more popular, he still didn't get a lot of traction in the election and didn't win any electoral votes. But that is, I think that's what people worry about the most. The other things that people talk about are the way that electors are chosen. We do see some states out there trying to create this interstate compact to manipulate the Electoral College. We've seen talk about trying to leverage the power of faithless electors to, again, deprive any candidate of a majority and throw the election into the House of Representatives. The fact is, we haven't had anything like that happen in the country since 1824. So it seems like with our big party coalitions that we have today, all that's just pretty unlikely.
Well, we do have some pretty odd things going on in this election cycle. We have a third party candidate, RFK Jr., who is polling more significantly at a higher percentage than a third party candidate has in a very long time. He hasn't made a decision one way or the other what he's going to do. And we have now a major party presidential candidate that many people are referring to as having been installed, as opposed to having gone through the process and being elected to that position. So it's a very odd sort of convergence of different factors going on. And again, I think really speaks to the need to have such a complex and multi-layered process of these kind of guardrails, these protections to be sure that it's safe. Do you think there's any chance of our country doing away with the Electoral College at any point or at any time soon?
So the biggest threat is this interstate compact that's out there, where states are trying to change their rules so that their presidential electors are chosen based on the nationwide popular vote. It's this whole scheme to try to force the Electoral College to rubber stamp the popular vote result without actually amending the Constitution. This is what Save Our States works against. We're trying to make sure that this never takes effect. If it did take effect, I think that courts would strike it down. They certainly ought to, although I never put my faith in federal judges. So that's a real threat. As far as amending the Constitution, not today. We're not in a moment where I think that's very likely. But we did see back in the 1970s some very serious efforts to try to amend the Constitution to either get rid of the Electoral College or kind of manipulate it in a way where it probably wouldn't have very much effect. I do think that there's a real threat just in the fact that most Americans don't understand it, right? That creates a problem. And that's why we made the documentary. We really want to help Americans understand it. I believe that when people do understand the Electoral College, most people come to support it.
Oh, 100%. And it's kind of ironic even that when you have a losing side and they want to say we should do away with the Electoral College, they're sort of in effect making the case for why we have to have the Electoral College, right? And so I am so appreciative that you guys, you, Trent, and at Save Our States are fighting to ensure that we have this system. It is fair. It's the fairest and most just system of running our elections anywhere in the world, really. We're very, very lucky that we have it. And I'm so thankful to you for coming on the show today and just trying to kind of get through this and break it down for us and really advocate for the continuation of it, because it's brilliant. And again, you guys have got to watch this documentary. It's a must watch, and it will really add to your understanding and your appreciation for how well our founders and the framers of our Constitution set us up for success here. So Trent, I can't thank you enough for being with me today and sharing all of your wisdom and expertise with us on Politically Basic today.
My pleasure, Kyle. Thanks so much.
Definitely going to have you back as we continue to understand all this. But thank you all for joining us on this episode of Politically Basic. We're committed to breaking down the basics so that you get to decide. Be sure to check us out at politicallybasic.com and follow us at Politically Basic so you don't miss an episode. And we'll see you next time.